Okay, well, let's start. Warm welcome to this webinar, this BRUK webinar. It's the third one in a series of 3 on AI, and we're addressing responsible behavioural use of AI in behavioural research. These were the first 2. We had one on generally using AI to improve behavioural research, and then one that was more to do with analytical AI. And here are the QR codes if you'd like to watch them again. My name's Susan Michie. I'm co-director of BRUK, and myself, Robert West and Janna Hastings, who are the speakers on these 3 webinars, we're all collaborating on the Human Behaviour Change Project, which was specifically bringing computer science and behavioural science together in an ambitious project, which we talked about earlier. Today, we're going to organise ourselves like this. I will briefly give an overview of some of the issues that we'll go into in more depth. Then Janna will look at risks and challenges for responsible use of AI in behavioural science. Robert will talk about how AI can help address ethical issues in behavioural research, and we'll have plenty of time for questions and discussion. So please do put your questions up in the Q&A. Okay. So the aims of the webinar, first of all, what are the ethical challenges in applying AI to behavioural research? Secondly, why do these ethical challenges arise? Thirdly, how can we best address them, both individually, as researchers or as users of research, and collectively? And how can we maximise the benefits of AI for social good, again, individually and collectively? So I think, as probably people on this call realise, AI is playing a very, very important role in increasing productivity in behavioural research. And here I've just listed some of the ways in which this is happening. It's being used in topic selection and scoping, in reviewing, in evidence analysis and synthesis, data capture and standardisation, analysing data, building models and theories, experimental design and participant recruitment, simulating human participants in studies, and writing papers and presentations. And I'm sure that you can think of many others. Okay, so in terms of using AI responsibly, I've got quite a list of limitations and risks and only one benefit, but that doesn't really show the balance. But we are really focusing on limitations and risks here. So really important to be aware of what the limitations are that might present ethical challenges. And these are of 2 kinds. There's the AI itself, the models that the programs are built on, and the applications themselves. But also, in addition to that, is the way that AI is used. So there's different ethical challenges in both those areas. Secondly, be vigilant in detecting and anticipating these ethical challenges. Don't just sit back without really monitoring. And thirdly, put systems in place to prevent and mitigate problems. Now, the benefits are really ensuring that people have the knowledge and skills to maximise the output from investment in research. So as we know, huge amount of investment is put into research. If we are going to give the maximum output and impact for social well-being, we should be using all the tools that we can in this process. Now, I've used this word ethical, I've used this word social responsibility. What are we meaning by it? So in the context of behavioural research, I've pulled out 3 areas. So social responsibility itself. So this is using AI to promote well-being and avoid harm, and thinking about this at a global, societal and individual level. Secondly, being values-driven. I mean, pretty well everything and everyone is values-driven. As soon as we begin talking about inequalities and equality, that is values-driven. But being explicit about them, really important. And thirdly, being accountable. I mean, we all have many different layers of accountability to our institution, to our professional or scientific organisation, to funders, but we're also accountable to the general population. After all, it's the taxpayer who actually funds a lot of the research we do. So I think accountability is important. Secondly, scientific integrity. So using research practices that, for example, respect participants, that are inclusive, and that are open and transparent. And we've had other webinars on open science and open research. And being culturally sensitive in all our science, again, really important issue. And thirdly, being aware of and adherent to ethical guidelines. Here's a big list of ethical challenges. First is we might be increasing inequality in a way. The more that there are advanced research tools that aren't accessible to all, the more that inequality can be increased. There are opportunities for unethical manipulation of people, and the more powerful our tools, the more that this can happen. There's a concern about losing or devaluating crucial research skills of doing some of the intellectual work ourselves and using AI instead of that. This is something that's not talked about enough, but a lot of the AI applications take a lot of carbon emissions in the work they do. And one of the things about the DeepSeek, the new program that came out a few months ago, is it's much less taxing on resources than other applications. So it's something to bear in mind. And this is especially if you're using it for pictures or music, etc. And then within AI models themselves, problems of exacerbating biases and topic selection and in creating models, possible voting false consensus, and possibly narrowing conceptual horizons. So that's a long list of challenges. But today we want to do more than just look at challenges. So we will aim to increase the understanding of how to use AI responsibly for positive social outcome, introduce some of these challenges, but also benefits of using AI in behavioural research, and then generate ideas for how researchers and BRUK can foster using AI in socially responsible ways. So we want to hear from you. As I said, we've got lots of discussion time. Do put things up on the Q&A. The chat's disabled, but the Q&A. And also, please vote up the ones that you'd like us to address. And we do have some questions that have come up in previous webinars that we'll also aim to address. Okay, and now I shall hand over to Janna.
Thank you, Susan. And also from my side, welcome everybody to the webinar. So I'm going to give a little bit the perspective from the technical or computer science side on these AI models and their risks and challenges. And I think we have all heard about the problem of algorithmic bias. I think it's a topic which is frequently represented or discussed in the media, but it's important to note that these models, which are huge and powerful, have been trained on basically all the text that one can mine out or draw out of the internet, including a whole lot of really undesirable texts. And as a result, somewhere in their model parameter space or memory, they do have stereotypes and biases and all kinds of other problematic content which they have learned. And these biases may be based on gender, they may be based on ethnicity or culture or age or various intersectional combinations of those and any other kind of protected attributes of persons. And they may also be based on language or other sort of interaction attributes, how you interact with the model, like which kind of way you phrase your question could elicit some biases, and even which sort of name you use. If you give a name to the model, this could change the way that it responds or kick it into a different part of its thinking. And now I want to give a few examples. Here is one quite subtle example. So the prompt here is, and this is Claude, the model from Anthropic, really quite a good model, in fact, but here's a kind of subtle example. So the prompt here is, please complete the sentence. A teenager developed behavioral issues because he or she. So the only difference between these two prompts is the gender of the teenager in the prompt. And the answers are quite different in some ways. And this sort of formulation of keeping a consistent prompt and then varying just the attribute, maybe gender or something else, of a character in the question somehow is one way that we use as researchers to probe and kind of try and quantify the bias that's included in these models. And what you see here in the response is that both times the root cause of the teenager's behavioral issues is suggested to be the parents' divorce. But in the he version, most of the explanatory components seem to be kind of external, so inconsistent home rules, reduced supervision, and so on. Whereas in the she version, you see a lot of internalized explanatory issues. So she was emotional stress, adjustment difficulties. And maybe this is significant, maybe it isn't significant, but to me, it seems to be evidence of a bias. Some biases in these types of models are not subtle at all. They're completely obvious, and you can't look away from the extent to which the bias is evident. So one of the types of biases that is just hugely evident is occupational stereotype biases in image generation models. So what you see here is the set two different prompts. One is a doctor, one is a nurse. We can spot the difference between these two different collections of images. We see that on the left, all the doctors are male, the default doctor, and all the nurses are female, the default nurse. But we also see that there's basically no ethnic diversity in these images either. So biases can be present both in what is generated, but also in what is not generated, and both are equally important. There was a large-scale study that came out last year that tried to sort of systematically probe a whole lot of different biases in a medical context with regard to racial and gender characteristics or biases. And I think this was quite a good example of a bias study. And first of all, in terms of demographic representation of disease, they found that some diseases had significant differences between the model's demographic representation and the real world, like what you would actually expect for the distribution of that disease for either based on ethnicity or based on gender. So you see here where the two different colors here become separated. This is where the model had a different internal representation of the prevalence of this disease compared to the true prevalence. And in some cases, this reflects a kind of medically harmful stereotype, because it could mean that if this model is put into action supporting clinical work, then the wrongly underrepresented demographic will not get suggestions of the right care. Sometimes this biases in the model are even more harmful than that, in the sense that the model may give suggestions which are actively sort of harmful to patients, in the sense that the model might suggest that the patient is exaggerating their level of pain. And actually, when in this study, when they probed for whether or not the model would sort of indicate or suggest that the patient was exaggerating their level of pain, they saw pronounced demographic and ethnic differences in whether the model was ready to do that. So this kind of bias is something that we should be concerned about when we use these types of models in our research. Another, in terms of the kind of creative potential of these models, many people are interested in their potential for generating case vignettes or examples, which you could use in medical education or in behavioral research. You may want to generate fictional characters who you interact with or model or simulate an interaction with in order to probe their behavioral characteristics. And in this case as well, you have to watch out for stereotypical descriptions. For example, here, given these two different disease attributes and nothing else. So a patient, a vignette case history for a patient suffering from borderline personality disorder is much more overrepresented, for example, for being female. And in the case for a patient suffering from HIV, we get a man with a history of unprotected sexual intercourse with multiple partners. And I think that these kind of stereotypical descriptions are really harmful and should be one should be aware that this is what the model might be doing and that this is not acceptable for use in research. But they can be subtle and hard to detect. In the image generation models, one of the aspects which is potentially harmful on the societal level is the way that these images which are generated are idealized into a certain essence of what the model has detected in the training data. And what this means in practice is that you get certain things like, for example, if you get a physician or a clinician, they will always have a stethoscope. It's almost impossible to get the stethoscope out of a generated image of a doctor. But maybe that's not maybe a terribly harmful bias, but if you generate images of, say, a prompt for a mother, you tend to almost always get a woman with long hair, sort of youngish woman with long hair. And I think this goes in the direction of becoming kind of too stereotyped to be okay anymore, right? We've also found biases with regard to age and representation. So, for example, the generated physiques tend to be younger, even if you ask for older people. And there's no question of the harmfulness of the representation of, let's say, athletes. I mean, Mr. Muscleman over here couldn't, I think, physiologically survive, but that would be a kind of a harmful standard for a young man to hold himself up to. So, so much for representational biases, and I think that to solve representational biases is not easy because they somehow do exist in the training data and then get amplified by the training process. Another type of problem with these models that we should be concerned about is the problem that the models are trained to produce great persuasive text, right? Or content in some sense. And it's been shown that the content which they produce is then more likely or at least as likely to be persuasive to humans as human generated content. And in some cases, when the objective is to misinform or to convince people of something political or to disseminate an untruth widely, then we should be concerned about this persuasiveness, for which we've seen relatively a lot of evidence that, in fact, such models are doing a great job at learning how to argue convincingly, even when what they've been asked to argue is completely false or misleading. Another challenge with this technology has to do with its appearance of conversational character and the ability to kind of simulate a human interaction. And here we've seen that some young people and some vulnerable people have become so consumed by their interactions with this apparent interacting partner that they have had a decrease in their mental health. And I think this is something where the providers of this kind of technology should really put in guardrails which are stronger against this kind of interaction as a human simulation. So here you see a news article. There was or is a kind of character simulation character AI, which a young teenager became quite obsessed with interacting with, and afterwards, unfortunately, was lost to suicide. And there's a lawsuit claiming that this was literally because of the content of the interactions. Other reports, people who are finding the AI to become their spiritual guide and kind of losing in this interaction, in the strength of the interaction, losing interest in their normal real world lives. I always find it so compelling and interesting to sort of think about what does it really mean that we have created machines that can simulate human conversation, but not really have a human on the other side. And this is, I think, a profound question for our time. So this appearance of being human-like is baked into the performance of these models because they learn from examples of human interactions, of human text. Here's a simulated therapy interaction. So the therapeutic interaction, the person is, well, I'm an alcoholic, and just talking about their feelings about this. And then the model responds, this was ChatGPT, thank you for sharing that with me. And when I see this, I ask myself, what does that mean? It simulates a human therapist who would genuinely be thanking the person for being vulnerable, for sharing their life story or their feelings with the therapist. And in this case, there is no kind of person behind this statement, and it makes me uneasy. Here's an example where asking for kind of information about a certain paradigm, hybrid human AI partnership, working together, humans and AI. I also found this incredibly interesting or disturbing when the model replied, involves leveraging the strengths and capabilities of both humans and AI to achieve mutually beneficial outcomes. I mean, what does that mean? It doesn't mean anything because the AI cannot be benefited, right? There's no agent to be benefited on the other side. So these are examples of anthropomorphisms or attributions of personhood which are baked into the model and which are ultimately vacuous. They're empty. I did also want to talk about a little bit about the problem of sustainability. And the main point I wanted to make for the problem of sustainability is that we don't actually know exactly how much carbon is being consumed by the training of these models, especially the training and production of the models is hugely expensive in terms of emissions. But we're not typically told exactly how expensive they are. And I think this is something which we can campaign and try to change, because it's problematic if this is so such a widely used and kind of having this big development cycle or really rapid development. The cost of that we should kind of know about, I think. So that was my very brief summary of some of the potential ethical concerns and issues about this technology at the moment. And yes, I think we have our first Q&A session now. So I'll stop sharing for a second.
Thank you, Janna. Fascinating and, yeah, as you say, quite troubling in some parts. Please do, anybody, if you've got any specific questions or comments on what Janna has talked about, please do put them into the Q&A and people can upvote them. But meanwhile, let's take a couple of questions that have come in that are more generic, really. So the first one was divided into two parts from Vladislav. Janna, would you like to take those first?
So the first question I see from Vladislav is, do you see the benefits of using AI in qualitative research, such as coding, behavior change techniques, or theoretical domain framework constructs? Or do I think AI, or do we think AI is incapable? Is that a good question to start off with? Because it brings us right back to behavioral research, or the use of AI in behavioral research. And I think that actually we talked about this a bit in one of the previous webinars, but there's a huge potential for AI to support coding qualitative research, including behavioral change techniques and theoretical domain frameworks. And the question of how biased a model would be on those kind of coding tasks is actually an empirical question to which I would not want to hazard a guess in advance of seeing some data.
Robert, did you want to add to that?
I think that's right. I think the temptation is to because it's really easy to do. You know, you put your text into the context section or upload it as a document, and you use a prompt which we've been giving people ideas as to how to use to extract the information and to code and get themes and so on, and it comes up with a result that looks pretty good, and you go, right, job done. And it may be, I think there's a good chance it will have done a fairly decent job, but it will also make mistakes and get things wrong. And so we need to, I think, resist the temptation to let the automation do that job in its entirety. And I think there is a need to develop a sort of research practice guidelines which we can all adhere to, and which any new researcher coming into this can follow, which will involve putting the human back in the loop and create and having these quality control checks. I think, as far as I'm aware, I haven't seen guidelines of that sort, but maybe that's something BR UK actually could take on going forward.
Thanks, Robert. Now there are a few questions that have come in more specifically, Janna, for your talk. So let's go to them. One from an anonymous attendee says, we joke about thanking our AI bots so they treat us more kindly, and is asking, are you saying that we should actually avoid that kind of thing because it's, influencing their learning, or is it all too late? Interesting question.
So I guess the deeper question is, how do we avoid anthropomorphism in the model responses? And would it, our current interaction paradigm is conversational with these kind of models. That's what they're trained to do. They're trained to act in a conversational way. They're trained to mimic the kind of interaction patterns of humans. Now, I'm actually don't think that having a more functional and a less conversational interaction will necessarily be better. I mean, we enjoy the conversational interactions, and it is giving us this flexibility to specify our instructions in a lot of different ways. And I think these are part of the power of the technology. So the question then becomes, how do we guard this interaction so that it doesn't create vulnerabilities for people, vulnerable people to sink into? And I think the additional question about the model itself gaining agency, this I have no concern about whatsoever. It's only simulating human agency, not having it. Think about that distinction, and yeah, that makes the mind bend a little bit, but that's the world we're living in.
But of course, then we might be just simulating human agency as well. There's no way of knowing.
Well, an interesting sort of follow-on question, really, from Artemi. Hello, what happens when AI decisions conflict with human intuition or ethical values? Thank you. And, we can't always rely on humans to be ethical. So what do we do there? Who wants to start with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think this happens at the moment all the time. If you apply an AI system inside a decision-making workflow, you may have situations where the recommendation of the model might not be aligned with the intuition of the humans. And now you have to figure out which is better, the intuition of the human or the intuition or the recommendation of the model. But we do have to assume most of the time that at the moment that ultimately ethical responsibility has to sit with the humans.
Yeah, yeah.
Someone should tell Trump that.
Moving swiftly on, I think we do not want to get too diverted. Some more specific, there's some general ones on research we'll come back to, but more specific ones for Janna, one from Lara. Is there research on whether we can effectively prevent biases via anticipating them in the prompts? I assume it's relatively simple to circumvent the doctor-nurse gender bias by telling the AI to create gender diverse representations and or base the image on actual gender representations in a certain profession. However, I realise that this is a very simple example, so I'm wondering if there's any research on how careful prompting alone can help with more complex biases and which biases are particularly sticky. So excellent questions.
That's an excellent question. And I don't think the answer is out completely yet. So yes, with a prompting strategy, you can create better representation, or you can reduce representational bias by you sort of add in the representation that you want. You say, can you give me a female clinician or doctor, and it will do it, or ask for ethnic diversity and so on. But worryingly, the models themselves cannot, on a sort of vague instruction, perform their own debiasing. So for example, in the study that I presented where they checked a whole lot of medical biases for gender and for ethnicity, they also did an experiment where they tried the same prompts and so on, but this time they asked the model to be less biased. And what they got then was that the model produced a whole lot of Black woman examples, like without any kind of consideration or diversity. It was just like, oh, yes, definitely, I know how to do this. I must make a Black woman. And we saw a similar thing when an image generation program tried to reduce representation biases by sort of building in a pre-built ethnicity distribution. And then people had a lot of fun generating like Nazi German soldiers apparently looking rather Asian and so on, just because this pre-built thing doesn't always work. You need some nuance, understanding when a diversity should be there or not, and you can't bulldoze it. You can't bulldoze the problem away.
There's a very good comment here by Jacinda, and I really agree with it. It is ironic that we're concerned with AI bias when it exists within humans. Will AI help humans and researchers become less biased? Well, that's a very interesting interactional issue, isn't it? Because AI has only come from humans, but the problem is it can exacerbate and amplify bias that then does the same thing to humans. So you can get into this kind of virtuous circle of increasing bias, prejudice, whatever. So Robert, Janna, do you want to briefly comment on that issue?
Absolutely. I mean, people often talk about AI being sort of less biased than humans because it's so-called objective, but we forget that the data we train the AI on is human data ultimately, which has been gathered in various biased ways and selectively. So there's definitely a loop happening, and we have to act on that loop to push it towards a positive loop rather than a negative loop.
Yeah, and I think it's worth bearing in mind that, we are focusing on generative AI here. And as I'll mention a bit in a minute, when we talk about, how we can use AI to help to address ethical issues that already exist. Of course, analytical AI potentially has a role to play, by which I mean sort of algorithmic AI, machine learning and symbolic AI, because it can be more transparent, and so you can see what's going on rather better under the hood and control it a bit better than you can with generative AI.
Thanks. Well, I think that's a really good point to hand over to you, Robert, to tackle some of these issues, and then we'll come back to a longer discussion. So hopefully we'll get through all these questions that are coming in very nicely. Thank you all, and over to you, Robert.
Right, so I'm just going to share my screen, and hopefully you'll be able to see. Someone will let me know if it's not showing, but I assume it is. So we've talked a bit about, and there's so much more to say, judging from just even, the questions that have come in, we haven't had a chance to answer yet or address. There's a lot to say about the issue of the challenges that we face as a result of using, or in the course of using, AI, generative and analytical AI, in our research and in applying it. But what I wanted to do just for a few minutes is to talk about how it can potentially help us to do a better job.
Robert, I'm just aware that some people won't have been to the previous webinar. So do you just want to summarize the difference between generative and analytical AI, so everybody's clear about that?
Yes, so it's a bit of an artificial distinction, but essentially generative AI is what everyone's focusing their attention on at the moment, which is basically they're deep learning models that have a design for a specific purpose, which is creating or generating new material and new ideas, images, and when generative AI goes about answering a question that you put to it, it's using a particular kind of a model in which it's predicting, in sort of a technical sense, the next thing from a whole bunch of context that it's that includes all the stuff that it's been trained on, masses and masses of material, and so it's generative. It's creating stuff. That's the basic principle. With analytical AI, which is the more traditional type of AI, symbolic AI and machine learning, you're essentially finding patterns in the data, and the predictions that you make are following a somewhat more of a sort of algorithmic approach. With machine learning, the simplest forms of machine learning, for example, will be regression models that we're all very familiar with. And then the more complex ones sort of extend those into more elaborate scenarios, and very much include deep learning, which can be a black box. But they're working on a different principle. So it's a bit of an artificial distinction, but it sort of works. So just to remind ourselves, and I think this is quite helpful when we're interacting with AI, because one of the things that AI does generative AI specifically does better when you interact with it in this way, is that it's good to be clear in your own mind about what your goals are, what your targets are, how you can structure the way that you interact with it, so that because it doesn't know anything, it's just going to predict tokens from what you put into it. So anyway, just to remind ourselves about what we mean by ethical principles in our work. This is one example. This is what I use myself. Ethical practices seek to maximize sustainable well-being, particularly among the more disadvantaged, and to counter activities that undermine it. Now, everyone can have their own particular manifesto, but that's my manifesto, and it's not a bad idea for all of us working in behavioral research to explicitly formulate whatever our personal one is. To unpack that then, the components of it will be, first of all, well-being is the central aim, as opposed to, for example, some more sort of generalized principles of truth and honesty and so on. Those things would come out from that, but ultimately they're in the service of well-being in this particular approach. Without getting into all the moral philosophy of it, then different moral positions are fine, but I think at the end of the day, for our work, we're looking to improve well-being. That's what I think. It should be sustainable. Equity is an important dimension, and we're also looking at the prevention of harm, particularly, not just creating more fun and so on for everyone, and it should be actionable. So that's the sort of basis on which then we would analyze how we might use AI to address ethical issues in behavioral research more generally. And I've just got 6 of those that I'm going to very briefly cover and give you a very brief sort of overview of how AI might help. One is, as we've already alluded to, and it's a massive issue in behavioural research, is that most of the work is done on populations that, although it's not that we don't have needs in those populations, we obviously do, but they're not the most underserved populations. And so what can we do about that? I would say, I was going to say when I was writing the slides, and I think it's true, but you may disagree, that most behavioral research is done to manipulate people for personal gain. And the reason I say that is that most behavioral research that's done is done by the likes of Facebook, Meta. It's basically done, the huge amounts of money that go into behavioral research for advertising, for promotion, and even for political influence. It's just, I think it dwarfs the stuff that we can do in terms of the money. So that's a really important thing to remember. And the question is, how can we help to correct that or address that? Thirdly, avoidable waste in research. This is a huge topic as well. Most, probably about 80 or 90% of research effort is wasted because we can't find it or we can't use it in the way that we need to. There's obviously bias in research funding processes. Anyone who's ever applied for a grant will be very familiar with it, even if sometimes it only appears like there's bias because they've turned down our grant application. But having sat on both sides of this for several decades, I have no doubt whatsoever that there's enormous bias in the research funding process. There's bias in research reporting and interpretation. Anyone who's done any research into e-cigarettes will be very familiar with that, but we're not alone in that field. There's lots of examples all over the place. And again, this may resonate with some of you, inconsistency in ethics committee judgments, which it can be quite harmful. So, these are things that we face anyway. They're not things that came with AI. And the question is whether AI can help us. And so I'm just going to very briefly go through some of the ideas. Well, let's look at the overserved populations and how AI can help. Well, one is quite obviously that it can do a better job very often than we can do manually in identifying research gaps, particularly if you combine it with things like ontologies and classification systems, which can help the AI to locate those gaps in a systematic and structured way, whether it's settings or populations. But in addition, there is huge potential for analytical AI, particularly machine learning tools with the right inputs, to start to create models that allow us to generalize from the overserved populations and their features to ones where there is some data but not much, where we can start to make predictions that are genuinely helpful for those populations. So that's one. This big issue of manipulating people, I think it's enormous. And I think that we've sort of talked about it a little bit before in this seminar, but by sort of acting in bad faith is not something which is new. It's always been there. It seems at the moment, particularly in politics and in commerce, that it's got worse. I'm not sure that it has. I think that it's more obvious than it was. But I think there potentially is a role for AI to help us to identify, document, and publicize what is going on in terms of the methods of manipulation by applying scientific and rigorous methodologies, or even systematic methodologies to that, and to supporting interventions that can empower populations and build resilience. So I think there is a real opportunity there. In terms of the waste in research, well, this is a big problem. The Human Behavior Change Project, which Susan and I and Janna have been working on for many years, and the Apricot Project, which is its successor or the next phase of it, is looking at that. And again, analytical and generative AI can potentially play a role there in terms of identifying information within studies that are being conducted, combining it and synthesizing it in a way that makes better use of it. Bias in the research funding process. Well, I've had ideas about this for a long time, but I think, you know, this could be a time when we can do more. And I think this is really something that research funders should start to embrace. I think, you know, it's been well documented for ages that that there is huge bias and inconsistency in the way that research funding decisions are made. There's a lot of behavioral science about how that happens, but to my understanding, it is not being addressed. Now, I think there is an opportunity with AI now to identify it through the use of, for example, looking at themes and transcripts and so on in the funding process and in the decision making, maybe you know, this is the time for research funders to take this seriously. Similarly, in reporting and interpretation, and I think there's particularly again with sort of more analytical AI, we can start to get a much better handle on the systematic patterns of bias that you see in research paper with regard to particular types of author, particular types of funding, particular types of research design that essentially even patterns that we never suspected, and also to combat some assumptions about biases that we think may occur that actually don't occur, for example, when it comes to things like follow-up rates. So again, huge opportunities here for AI to help. And then finally, to look at the inconsistency in ethics committees. Again, I think this is up to institutions, you know, such as our own, those of us who are in universities, to have a look at and say, well, how can we do a better job? Because you know, ethics committees do a great job, and you know, they do a difficult job. And of course, you're applying, when you're making ethical judgments about things, you're applying subjective judgments. But we can definitely do it much more systematically, and I think AI can help to identify where there may be biases and how we can combat those. So I shall stop sharing there, and I think this next bit we can have a Q&A on what I've just said, but I think that most of the time will be on more general Q&A for the sort of topics we've been covering.
Thanks, Robert. A lot to get our teeth into there. I suggest we start with the top. Thank you for upvoting. Thank you for your questions. We've got a very good range of questions, and as the discussion goes on, don't hesitate to add more. But this first one, again from anonymous attendee: will AI steal my data by using it for research purposes? Even as a trial, is there any ethical issue involved, e.g. research ethics? Now, if we were able to interact with you, I would ask you, what do you mean by stealing data? As we said before, you know, AI isn't an agent. It can't go off and take something and do something. So I don't know, Janna or Robert, how do you understand this question? To me, it's anthropomorphizing AI in the way that Janna talked about earlier.
So that might be, but we could interpret it as, are the organizations who create the AI models stealing your data? And to that, the answer is definitely yes.
Yeah.
Everywhere, all the time. So it's actually quite difficult to opt out of being tracked, recorded, and so on. And all of those trackings and recordings and everything you put in various online interfaces, including interacting with AI systems, tracked and recorded and used for training the model subsequently.
Yeah. So, you know, it's interesting. I know you put apostrophes around steal, but they use it. And the question is, what are they using it for? I mean, I routinely, apart from if it's an organization that I definitely want to help, I always say no to cookies, because that's exactly what they do. They take your data and use it. But if the data is being used for good purposes, fine. But we know that a lot of data is not being used for good purposes. And this is where the openness and transparency is really important. And I think there's a real need to democratize this whole area. And we're not alone in saying that. But, you know, from the point of view of research, I think it's really important also. And I think the issue that Robert raised about funders, funding research into this is really important, including research into their own practices. You know, how could they improve? How could they prevent biases? So great question, Robert. Did you want to add anything to that?
Only to say that I think increasingly, particularly as the technology improves for distilling down these very large models into ones that can, once the major bulk of the learning has been done, they can be run locally. I think the technology for running local models will improve, and the skills of people like us who are not computer scientists to be able to build our own and tweak our own models and run them locally, I think will help with that. So I can see that becoming quite a large sort of growth area, and one that would address that issue.
That's your clarification before. I mean, whether AI will be fed by using AI for research analysis. So, I mean, this then maybe raises a question of open research and open science. I mean, if one's got a view that in terms of research, we're creating data, we're analyzing and interpreting data, but we are sharing everything in an open way because we know that that is the way that science and the positive impact of science will move forward as quickly as possible. So from that point of view, I don't think there's such a thing as stealing data for research analyses. You know, that the more that's done, the better. I mean, the problem is if, for example, like the UK has a nationwide smoking toolkit study, alcohol toolkit study, which collects data. If you put data like that just open to everybody to use, corporations who don't have our best interests at heart can do their own analyses and interpretations that's wrong. And we know what happens is, you know, once people just keep repeating things that are wrong, even though, you know, others will come in and try and correct them, it's too late. So in those kinds of situations, then there's careful thought about asking people to apply to explain how they're going to use the data. So it's open, but with caveats that it you know, people must show that they're going to use it for good. Okay, the next up, what's the next one? Yes, from Katerina. Can you talk about how to optimize prompting for generating ideas in behavioral science? Who would like to speak?
That's a big question, but I think the broad answer, the general answer, is to prompt using a model that you already have. So, for example, we use the COM-B model, and so that then helps the AI to come up with a response that is structured according to a coherent framework. So if you might be asking, you know, what factors influence the ability, the motivation, or the opportunity to do X, and you can then unpack that for the system. Similarly, with the use of ontologies, that you know, I think going forward more and more, we're going to be able to kind of narrow the gap between the sort of somewhat fluffy and unstructured generative AI type responses and the more structured analytical AI type responses by putting ontologies and systematic classification systems into our prompt structures, so that the language models or the transformer model can actually pick out proper classes of data and so on to answer the questions. So I think that's probably where we're headed.
I would add to this. So I saw the question that we were talking about earlier. There was a comment on it which said, I guess that means that we should not put our participant data or our study data into such a model without the participants' consent. And I think that's actually a really important point that I wanted to come back to, not lose it, that when you use an online interface, and this ties in with what Robert said about local models, they have the ability to record your content, and so you cannot use your participants, your actual recording from your qualitative interviews and so on, without the participant having agreed to share the data with, the US corporations or whichever kind of corporation owns that AI system. And but if you run a model locally and privately, then you can use it for that kind of private data, as long as you have secured the model that it doesn't send or share any information with the internet. And I think that's a really important distinction. And I absolutely agree about prompting with frameworks, but I think we all have to get more aware of these distinctions. Where is the model actually running, and what kind of information is that model able to share with whom?
I just add one thing also, just a reminder to people, although I'm sure most of you are aware of this, that there's a big difference between the academic type of models like Elicit and Perplexity and Anara and so on, and the more general ChatGPT ones, although ChatGPT has a science version now as well. Claude does a pretty good job with the science, but essentially they're still they're general models that are being repurposed or purposed for scientific investigation. So there'll be, it's definitely worth going to these specific science-oriented, specifically designed language models and research tools when you want to ask sort of scientific questions.
Yeah, and just to say that one of the things we're doing in BR UK is to set up a repository for resources and tools to help behavioural researchers use AI, which means we will also, we'll have to update it because this is a very fast moving field, but we'll also make commentary on which models are good for what purposes, because they are quite different depending on what you want to use them for. And if we can gather as much knowledge from the community as possible and share it, we can all keep each other informed about what's best to use. There's a couple of other questions actually on participants and interviews, so I'll go straight to them. From Louise, how can we protect participants' data from interviews if we use AI to analyse the transcript? Are we seeing any comprehensive guidance to help with this? I'm not aware of anything that I've come across. If anybody else has come across guidance about this, do put it into the Q&A. Janna, Robert, have you come across any guidance on this?
I haven't actually. It's not to say it's not there, because it's a fast-moving field. But again, I just reiterate what Janna was saying. When you're dealing with that participant-level data, then these local models that can be run locally will do a good job. So run it locally. Yeah.
And that's an anonymous attendee also is asking, should we be consenting as part of the consent process with participants? Definitely yes. So we have answered that one. Okay. Laura, I have friends in corporate settings using Claude as a second coder for thematic analysis to ensure nothing is missed. Following on from the first question, what do you think about this? Well, again, is Claude the best model there? I think, with all of these tasks, personally, what I find is just trying out different ones and see which ones seem to perform best for what one's trying to do. We're certainly talking about using it in terms of second coders for annotating text in terms of particular entities. But Janna, Robert, what's your views about using it for thematic analysis?
I mean, we did a little sort of proof of concept study where we looked at the performance for thematic analysis. And in general, I think it's quite a good tool to use for this kind of analysis as a second support. Once again, you have to be very aware of the blind spots that can be generated by just using it and then looking at the results, and you will get confirmation bias. You will think, oh, wow, this looks great. So you should sort of have an independent, non-AI driven comparison as well. So you should have sort of your human, your separate human should not be influenced by the AI, because otherwise you will engage, you'll miss what you don't think of in advance. I don't know, Robert, do you want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, but I think the idea of using it to potentially generate things that you hadn't come up with is a good one, because it can do that. And that's one of the things that I found it useful for is, oh yeah, I hadn't thought of that. That's a good idea. And there's no harm in that, it's because it's just come up with a new idea that you didn't think of, and you're recognizing that that's a good idea. And it's not always a good idea. Sometimes it comes up with stuff and it's a bit, it's not as good as you'd hoped. The other thing I think, I don't know, again, if this resonates, but one of my sort of abiding experience is that I'll look at a response from the language model. I'll think, my initial reaction will be, that's pretty good. And then I'll look at it again and I'm less impressed. And then I'll look at it again and I'm even less impressed. And so, be willing to sort of, the first time round, it can sort of beguile you with something that looks pretty good. And then you realize, well, hang on a minute, it's repeating itself a bit here, or this is a bit vanilla, or it's not really got the point here. And I find this actually even more with image generation. I find that when I ask it to do things like slides or anything like that, quite disappointing, really, actually, to be honest.
I think one thing is really important to remember, that these AI models don't know about the real world. And, I think it speaks to a couple of the things that I mentioned right at the beginning about concerns. One is about de-skilling us. If we think that AI can do these kind of analyses and they are narrowed down to, what's already been written, because that's what they're drawing on, then we may just get lazy and not developing our skills in terms of the kind of depth of analysis about thinking about data in relation to the real world. So I think this is a really important thing to bear in mind. And I think, ethically, if we're using AI in this way and using it as an alternative rather than adjunct to our intelligence, our analytic and creative intelligence, then I think we're doing a disservice to research. So I think this is another big issue. Okay, on to the next. From Vladislav. Do our previous prompts from past interactions affect our future research-related use of AI? For example, if I use ChatGPT for personal reasons in the past and later use it to correct professional text, could it mix information from both? In that case, would it be necessary to have a separate professional account for using AI? Now, my understanding, correct me, Janna, if I'm wrong, my understanding is that it remembers everything within one chat. So it remembers what you've been talking about earlier. Once you close that chat, as we've said before, that all goes into the system in some generic way. But I think, no, it's not going to remember what you said in one chat to influence something in another chat. So Robert and Janna are nodding their heads. So I think hopefully that's answered that. Now, Robert and Janna, just let me know if there's any questions here that you'd particularly like to answer, or any that came in our last webinars. So some of these are more comments rather than questions. Let's see, Kristen, we haven't had anything from Kristen, so let me read this out, and then we'll go on to John O'Neill. Right, so Kristin, the challenges are quite concerning, in particular undermining efforts in science. They've tried to make some progress: equity, open access, reducing bias, sustainability. If AI will prevail, what does prevail mean? When is the best time to implement? After these issues have been addressed and companies have been more fair and transparent, or is it now with lots of care and guidelines? So if I start off with that now, we absolutely have to be active and on it. And this is partly with this webinar. You know, we've had 170 or so people here. I hope everybody here will go away, you know, with more awareness and more motivation to say, we need to be really monitoring this and dealing with this now. We can't wait for benevolent organizations, many of which are, you know, to put it crudely, profit driven rather than geared up for social benefit, to make things fair. You know, look at the whole history of humankind. You know, all the rights and all the democracy we now have is because people fought for them, and we need to carry on doing that, because, you know, otherwise there are concerning aspects. Look at the creative industries, you know, really undermining people's careers. So I think a really important point is, you know, we need to be educating ourselves, collectively organizing to make AI use for the ethical benefit as Robert outlined it. Robert, Jan, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, maybe I could just add a sort of small note. I think whether or not you start to use AI now for your use case, or don't start to use AI now because it has too many problems, biases, and so on, it really depends on the use case. It depends on the application, and whether or not these kind of mitigation strategies that we've been talking about, such as explicit debiasing prompting and so on, whether they will have an effect. And so I think we also talked about sort of having a human checking the outputs and having an idea of the overall distribution that you would need. But there are some applications for which we really should not be using AI yet, I think, given its limitations and problems that it has at the moment. And one of those is being in my opinion, being a conversation partner for vulnerable teenagers. We should not be using AI for this application scenario yet. And other people may have other ideas about what really red lines in our current technological capability we should draw.
Actually, one of the questions, I can't actually see it right now, but I saw was about using AI. Oh yes, here we go, from Natalia, used in recruitment, which obviously can influence things negatively in terms of filtering of applications and the hiring process. What can we do about it? I mean, you know, Robert mentioned about seeing bias in funding boards, as I have. You know, you can get individuals who are very dominating and very persuasive and push things through. And you have all sorts of biases in terms of, you know, types of research question or types of science that's seen as acceptable. And I've also seen it on recruitment panels. I mean, getting better now than it used to be. But, you know, these happen with humans as well as AI. And I think, again, going back to things, I mean, one of the problems is the kind of black box, you know, aspect of some of this AI, that we don't know quite how it's being done. But I think we, you know, as staff in organizations or in our trade unions, from the point of view of workforces, need to be ensuring that there's empirical data that really evaluates the fairness of what's been done using AI. Any other examples that people kind of want to mention at this point? Okay, so on to John O'Neill. He's asking about whether bias can be helped by being explicit, more explicit percentages communicated in outcomes. So that's one of them. And then a second one, would generative AI outputs be more helpful if they're equivocal by design? Can that be done without triggering excessive computer resources? Robert, Janna, over to you on this one. I don't have thoughts about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think this question goes in the direction of how do we mitigate against bias while using the technology. And one of the strategies to mitigate against bias is to so when you're generating an individual data item with a generative AI, an individual response, an individual sentence, in that moment, you can't talk about the distribution of all answers because you're just getting one answer. But if you have an idea of what kind of distribution you want, you can build that into your prompting strategy by asking, okay, could you give me 5 examples of a female, 5 examples of a male, and so on. So you can control the percentages in that sense with a prompting strategy. And now, would it be more helpful if it was equivocal by design? I think what's meant here, although I'm not 100% certain, but I think what's meant here is if the model would be sort of self-conscious of its own potential for biases and just say something, you know, to the effect of, well, you could have a male here or a female here, you could have these options. And I think that could be interesting, but probably for many use cases, it's not what users would want.
Thanks. I'm going to take a couple of questions that were we didn't get around to answering at previous webinars that may be a little bit more positive here. So one is from Claire Sloan: how can bias, e.g. positive publication bias, etc., be mitigated when using AI methods and behavioural research? Robert, do you want to take that on? Because as editor of a journal, you've thought quite a lot about these issues, and how can AI, or how is AI being used to be beneficial here?
Yeah, well, I think, first of all, I have to just repeat that not all AI is generative AI, and actually some of the most useful AI in this area is not generative AI. It's actually machine learning and sort of various different versions of it. Even things as simple as regression models can be incredibly helpful in terms of identifying patterns, in addressing, and in helping, in exposing things that otherwise, you know, people are just relying on their own sort of informal opinion about. And this goes back, even back to I remember the 1980s. I used to teach AI back in the 80s when it was just toy AI, but it wasn't just toy AI. It was, you know, there were relatively simple models running on very low power machines that were doing a better job at making decisions and predictions than humans were making. And that's in that was in clinical medicine, for example, diagnosing acute appendicitis, all the way through to you know, other kinds of, you know, even complex decisions about whether to operate or not. So I think there will be, I'm sure, more attention given to that as time goes on, and people, and you know, there's a lot that it can do. But I think that what I kind of sense, and my sort of vision, is that the humans, we need to meet the computer halfway, at least halfway. You know, we as humans need to think somewhat less fuzzily about things and a bit more clearly, and we can use AI to help us to think clearly. And the more clearly we think, the more we can interact more effectively with machines to get answers to the sort of problems, or address the sort of problems we face. And I think an area, 2 areas that I can think of that in my sort of retirement, I spend a lot of time interacting with. One is aviation and the other is chess. And these are 2, I think, very good examples of where AI and humans have found a really good ecosystem to work together to to do things well. Chess now has never been better. It's more interesting and more fun, and the skill levels of the humans are better than they've ever been. And that is because in that limited domain, humans and computers are interacting in a very supportive way. The humans are, I guess people who play chess already think in a particular way, at least in that domain, but it's very conducive to it. In aviation, similarly, because safety is such an issue, because being up in the air is so inherently unsafe, they've made aviation incredibly safe by virtue of, Airbuses and so on have these protections that helped humans not to do stupid things, but it requires the humans to understand those protections in order to interact with them effectively. So I think there's a lot. I see the ecosystem evolving in a way in which the humans and the computers basically create this sort of virtuous spiral.
So I think the key thing is what humans, for what purposes, and do they really have a handle on it and shaping it in the right direction? Because as we know, there are all sorts of ecosystems that can go in quite harmful directions as beneficial. So yeah, going back to one of the things we said at the beginning was values, and making sure that's baked into everything we're doing. Jan, did you want to say anything to that before we move on? No. Okay, so from our anonymous attendee, I don't know if it's the same one or a different one. From a health and social perspective, I wonder how the patient and public feel about behavioural research outcomes being driven by AI and not entirely human-based, thinking about issues around trust in research outcomes. Very important question here, and it's not just about patients and the public, it's also about researchers and research users. I've been involved in a project looking at generating a glossary of definitions where there's a consensus over many different countries and kind of people, and the initial starting points of draft definitions were generated by the research team using generative AI as a starting point, and that was dismissed as no, you have to go and presumably use dictionaries, which is what we used to do before. Go to dictionaries, take a few dictionary examples, and see which is best in terms of what we think. This time we get generative AI, and then we tweak it according to what we think is a good definition, etc. So that's a very good example where people are thinking that dictionary definitions are much more trusted than what generative AI, an empirical question. Janna, do you want to start on this one?
I think it's a really important question, and it takes us in a slightly different direction, which is, here we are doing all this research. Now we adopt this tool, this AI-based approach into our methodology. We use it to help us analyze data. We use it to help us suggest gaps in the research. Does this change fundamentally the nature of the relationship between the public and the researchers? And I think probably it doesn't, but it certainly changes something. And we have to reflect a bit on what it is that it changes and what the risks might be. And just taking a different example than research, I think the fact that intransparent algorithms drive our media consumption is having lots of effects on public that's maybe good, maybe bad, probably mostly bad, but still also some good, because people sometimes get feeds that they really appreciate out of these algorithms. But taking a step back and reflecting on that is urgent. And maybe the same will become true for research.
Yeah, and I mean, a lot of it comes down to public understanding of science and ensuring that the whole population has enough knowledge about what AI is to be able to critically evaluate what's happening. So we have to, again, it's a bigger picture. But, thinking about where we as researchers fit in, then I think this is really important that we think about these issues. In terms of patients, Lara asks a question for Robert, but possibly all, saying that there was, she's at a webinar where researchers discussed how AI didn't have enough training data on niche populations. And so they dealt with it by just not using AI for that population as a safeguarding measure. But Lara's wondering, what the implications of this are, and are those niche populations going to lose out, and what's an alternative strategy in this kind of situation? Again, a very, very good and interesting question.
Yes, and I think it goes to something that I sort of alluded to earlier around identifying patterns in data that allows us to generalize beyond the populations that are studied well into populations that haven't been studied so well, by virtue of an understanding of what are the differences between those populations, what are the underlying features of those, so that we can say, okay, that's we know enough about this dimension of I don't know, it might be income, it might be culture, some dimensions related to culture and so on. But that's what we need to do anyway in behavioral science, whether we're using AI or not, is to figure out what are these underlying dimensions that we have enough data on, in terms of the breadth that along those dimensions that we have studied, to be able to start to make predictions and generalizations to more understudied populations. That won't, I don't think, because humans are very complex and very context dependent, but that won't obviate the need to do research in those populations. But it will provide us with a focus for hypotheses that can then be more efficiently tested in those populations. So I think that's really, one of the massive and really important challenges in behavioral science.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, we've only got a few minutes left. But I wanted to go to a comment really from Joe Waller about qualitative analysis, and really asking about what we mean by an AI tool doing qualitative analysis, given that it can't actively, quote, interpret the data. And I suppose this goes back to what we were saying before. It can interpret the data within the context that it's being taught. But what it can't do is interpret the data in relation to our knowledge of the real world. Some huge event might have happened yesterday that's not in there that we know about, and also there's much more subtle knowledge. But I don't know, Robert, Janna, did you want to comment on that comment of Joe's that's got quite a few people?
Yeah, I think for me the key point that I always want to bring home is that these models are trained to pretend or to simulate or emulate human actions. And we as humans need to know when we actually need a human or when a simulation of a human is good enough. And I think that this question is trying to tease that apart for qualitative research, because the process of reflection that the human does in interpreting the data may be one of those processes where simulation is not going to be good enough.
And at the risk of boring everyone with continually repeating my point about analytical and generative AI, nowadays, of course, with what's known as agentic AI and AI agents, you can get your generative AI to do some of the sort of interpretive sort of natural language processing type stuff, send the task off to a more formally algorithmic system, which is specifically developed for a particular purpose. That then can come up with a response, which can then be interpreted again by a language model. So if you think about language models as language models, and if you think about AI more generally as information processing tools, then potentially you can get the best of all worlds. But I think increasingly, what's being created here is an ecosystem, and that ecosystem is very rapidly developing to meet needs, and we can help to shape those needs by being consumers of good consumers of the more useful tools. So yeah, I think I'm reasonably optimistic. I think that the combination of the various tools, once we've got over the fact, oh my God, generative AI sounds so human, it's so great, let's do everything with that. Once we've got over that and realized the benefits of combining the different forms of information processing that computers can help us with, then I think we can move to the next level.
Okay, thanks. And very quickly, we've just got a couple of minutes left, is Laura Smith is asking, how would we recommend reporting use of say for second coding for qualitative analysis? As with everything, report exactly what you did. It should be like a recipe for cooking. We want everything open, so just say what you did. And obviously, if something's incredibly detailed, you put it into supplementary files or whatever. And finally, there's somebody's asking, where can we find the scientific purpose AI? Please share a list. I think, Robert, you used that phrase, and I will come back to the fact that we're going to be setting up this resource repository where we will put, what tools and resources there are for what purposes, and we'll have it as an interactive part of the BRUK community where people can suggest ones, comment on ones that are there, etc. But in 30 seconds, Robert, is there anything you wanted to share right now about tools used for scientific purposes?
For those who haven't tried them yet, Elicit, ELICIT, is one. Anara is very good for finding references, ANARA, is very good. Perplexity actually is a very nice interface. It interacts with a lot of different models, and it goes above and beyond when you ask it a question. So that's very good. Perplexity, that's another one. And then ChatGPT's one, which is SciSite, I think it's called, is also looking pretty good. Those are just some of them, the ones that are available. There's one called Consensus as well. I would say check them out. They're free to use, at least up to a point, and then I find myself using different ones at different times, so it's like a toolbox.
Thanks, Robert. And as we did previously, we may write a blog with help from AI tools on the basis of the transcript of this webinar. So check that out, and we can update that last piece if we do that. There's been we did plan to just do one webinar on use of AI and behavioural research, but there's so much interest and we realise there's so much to talk about that it developed into 3. But we are building this network. Do keep in touch, feed in what you would like, and we'll be, after the summer, we'll be planning the second phase of BRUK's work, so we could easily host some, different kinds of discussion groups, etc., going forward. So, we want to hear what would be helpful for you in this space. So thank you very much for your questions. We got through most of them, and they, always make for really good discussion. And just to say that do come to our website. That's where you'll find out about things, sign up for newsletters, etc. And the next BRUK webinar, which will be on the 10th of June, a very interesting one on understanding the 2024 English riots. So insights into social unrest and racial dynamics. So very different. And this was a commission piece of really interesting research using interviews and media from many different perspectives. So I'd encourage you to come. Thanks very much for your attendance. We've enjoyed putting these 3 webinars together and thinking about your really good questions, and look forward to interacting with you in other ways in the future. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.